2 weeks before Christmas, my phone lit up in the middle of a sleepy Friday with a message from my dad. Christmas is family only. Claire's in-laws are elite. We think it's better if you sit this one out. It was 3 short lines that read like a verdict. The screen lighted my face in an empty cafe, and for a second I tried to read context into the spacing. Was there a missing comma? A joke I wasn't in on? And then I felt the ordinary, specific kind of smallness that comes from being quietly erased by people who, ostensibly, love you. I stared at the words until someone behind me cleared their throat, and the sound snapped the spell. I put the phone back in my pocket with a practiced calm. That was my first lesson about reactions. You control them in public because whatever you do privately can be turned into an explanation you don't want to give. I ordered more coffee. My parents were old school about certain things, about how success should look and who should tell you that you had made it. Family pictures, framed gallery openings, thank you notes for hostess gifts. Those were the currencies they understood. Claire had learned to spend them well. She married into a family with a certain polish and a certain expectation, and she seemed to enjoy the choreography of that life. RSVPs, coordinated outfits, small talk that smelled faintly of linen and approval. She did everything with the right smile, at the right angle. I had learned to be invisible instead, not because I wanted to be someone else, because my work demanded the quiet of a lab, the privacy of a server room, the late nights where the only light came from code and takeout boxes. I built things that did not photograph well for holiday cards, machine learning models, cloud integrations, supply chain logic that smelled like metal, and data rather than champagne. I built SupplyWise AI from the spare hours between a newborn seed round and a rented workspace on the wrong side of town. I did what founders do when they are stubborn and have no cushion. Hustle, pivot, build, raise, sleep in shifts. At MIT, I learned to translate edge cases into robust systems. For 3 years, SupplyWise AI reduced inefficiencies in global logistics by predicting demand surges and routing inventory with a precision that made procurement managers weep with relief. We raised multiple funding rounds. The company reached a valuation the press would later call impressive. $620 million, and a couple of magazines that matter framed us as the quiet company changing an industry. To my parents, though, the details of purchase order algorithms and integration timelines were abstract and invisible. To them, success wore pearls and a family name, not a spreadsheet. I kept it that way on purpose. There is dignity in privacy. There is also a tactical advantage. It's easier to be measured and deliberate when people aren't trying to fit your life into their expectations. I drove a modest Honda Civic I kept specifically for family occasions. It was small, reliable, and did not invite questions. I answered calls from my parents in the hallway, on mute, while discussing term sheets with investors in my office 2 floors above. It was not shame, it was a boundary. And then Harrington Industries asked to meet. When the email arrived, Charles Harrington's office requesting a partnership meeting with SupplyWise AI and offering 3 time slots, my inbox pinged like a metronome. Harrington Industries was a $4 billion conglomerate with interests in manufacturing, logistics, and a famously conservative board. Blake, my sister's husband, worked there in a junior executive role. Claire had married up into a world that measured respectability by how many family crests hung in the study. The idea that our companies might talk was, in strictly professional terms, a match worth having. In human terms, it was a tightrope. I had told almost no one in my family about SupplyWise. My parents knew I worked in tech. In their eyes, that meant something nebulous involving youth and promise, not necessarily the kind of scaled, revenue-generating company that made CFOs stare at slides and adjust their reading glasses. Keeping the lines separate had been, for years, a small, satisfying rebellion. When the Harrington request came through, I told the team in a matter-of-fact way that felt like a weather report. Major prospect. Meeting on Monday. Bring the deck. Michael Torres, our chief strategy officer, stood up from his desk and clapped his hands like he was keeping rhythm for a parade not yet started. We should run through the integration timeline again, he said. Lisa Park, our CFO, removed her glasses and narrowed her eyes at the slides. David Chen, in finance, was already sketching scenarios. 3-year churn, realized savings, the contours of the kind of ROI that would get a conglomerate to sign. We worked the way we always did, obsessively, with a cruelty to detail that was actually care. We rehearsed demos until the code behaved like a well-trained dog. We practiced answers to questions we could hear coming from the other side of the room. Compliance liabilities, enterprise support, the specifics of latency. We polished the language around the partnership conception. This was not a white paper exercise, but a business that could shave a meaningful percentage off Harrington's global procurement costs. The lobby at Harrington's building was the kind of place built to make people consider lineage. A Fortune magazine cover, framed and escorted by chrome, sat behind the receptionist's head in a black frame that made everything else feel smaller. I noticed it the way you notice a painting in someone else's house, an artifact that shows you how they want to be seen. Monday morning, I wore a tailored gray suit, not ostentatious, not a power statement, a tool like a good pair of shoes. I wanted to be recognizable as a professional who belonged in a boardroom. My team arrived with practiced calm, carrying tablets and a prototype iPad that hid the demo's underbelly. Michael swung a travel mug at me. "You good?" he asked. He had been with me since our seed days. His loyalty was practical and fierce. "Good," I said, which in our language meant ready, which in personal language meant braced for anything. I gave one last look at my phone before putting it in the pocket of my blazer. I had been careful not to tell my parents the meeting time. Some things change only if you choose the moment and shape of their revelation. We took the elevator up to a suite that smelled faintly of leather and decisive money. The conference room was a rectangle of deep wood and light. The table could have seated 20. My slide deck prefaced the demo with 3 crisp slides: problem, our solution, and realized savings. The demo was clinical. It usually is. Algorithms are not showmanship. They're choreography. When Blake walked in with Charles Harrington and Patricia Harrington at his arm, the room's air shifted like a stage cue. There are little social signals that people carry with them, the way someone's cuff is pressed, the visible sheen of a partnership bracelet, the particular cadence of introductions, and everyone in the room read them. Blake's smile was a practiced one. Patricia's was the courteous smile of someone used to being seen in a particular light. Charles Harrington moved like someone who had built a business by being the final authority in rooms, measured, precise, the kind of man who could both negotiate price and write it down as an expectation in his mind. Blake's eyes skimmed the table and, for a second, stumbled. I saw recognition in the half-second before he masked it. He had seen my picture somewhere, maybe at a wedding, maybe in a mention. It was the kind of recognition that tries on a new fact and does not yet know the fit. We began the way boardrooms always begin: a few courtesy slides, a handshake, the kind of business light talk that keeps relationships warm. I started the presentation with a clear problem statement: the cost of idle inventory in the Harrison's manufacturing lines, the percentage of lost sales attributed to misallocated components, the cumulative drag on operations. My voice was steady. I navigated the demo like a surgeon, precise incisions where needed, no flourish. Then we moved into the case studies and the slide with our financials. A high-level overview, our funding rounds, our performance metrics, and the valuation in a line that read $620 million. People in procurement shift in their seats when numbers become tangible. Blake's expression, which had been the practiced politeness of a good host in his own family home, flattened for a second into something rawer. Surprise. He flicked his eyes to Charles and then back to me, the way someone compares 2 photographs to test if they're the same person. "You're Jade," he said, not a question so much as an alignment of facts. Yes, I said. It is a strange, delicate thing to be recognized not as the sister in the photos, but as the professional in the slides. For my parents, who measured me by different standards, this was a reclassification they had not authorized. For the room, it was simply a data point. Charles Harrington watched me for a long breath before responding. He folded his hands on the table like he was centering a thought. Then he smiled, a quick, surprised half-smile, and let out a soft laugh, the kind of sound that never quite approaches derision because it is threaded with a more complicated emotion, recognition mixed with irritation. "Well," he said, with the room leaning forward on that single syllable, "this is interesting." The air in the conference room recalibrated. Where there had been a social hierarchy that slotted people into neat compartments, my presence became a small earthquake. Everyone in the room, including the Harrington entourage, had to decide, were they here to perform the rituals of family alignment or the mechanics of a business agreement? That was the pivot point. In business terms, it is simple. Competence displaces pedigree when it reduces cost and risk. In family terms, it is messier. Pride and social capital do not yield easily to line items and margins. I felt both the quiet vindication of being recognized for my work and the slow burn of what that recognition implied. That my parents had misread a life I had quietly constructed while they were cataloging other people's appearances. There was a brief lull as the Harringtons absorbed the fact that the woman making the case before them was the very person their son's family had said should be uninvited from Christmas. You could see the thoughts recalibrating, how this would be reworded at dinner, how this fact would be worn on their side of the table. I kept talking through the lull. It is what you do when you are the one with expertise in your hands. You keep the gravity of the room on the substance. I walked through use cases, integration timelines, a schematic of how our API would communicate with Harrington's legacy systems without causing the kind of downtime that brings boards to emergency meetings. I spoke about security and compliance, and Lisa interjected with an assurance about our audit trails. Michael outlined a pilot timeline. The language was intentionally neutral, designed to let facts breathe. Blake, to his credit, did not try to turn the moment back into a family tableau. He was surprised, and his face betrayed it, but he kept his head in the business. Patricia, on the other hand, maintained a special breed of propriety that meant she did not know where to place this new fact about me. She shifted her phraseology, the kind of small adjustment people make when a narrative has been changed and they need to find the correct politeness for the new draft. Charles leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "We have been talking internally about how to modernize the supply side of our textile operations," he said. His voice had the economy of someone for whom words are tools. "Your approach would, on paper, reduce our warehousing overhead by a significant margin. I don't make decisions based on family ties or social calendars. I make decisions on return and risk." There it was, the line between what mattered in business and what mattered in family. He spoke it cleanly. The room coughed like an audience of people rediscovering their seats. After the formalities, during the demo's Q&A, Patricia's attention kept flicking back to me in intervals that felt personal. Once she leaned over and said softly, "You're so composed." There was no malice, just the bafflement of someone recognizing an unknown thing and not being sure how to incorporate it into the script they had for their life. I answered her as a CEO, not as the daughter she had declined to understand, because that is what was required in that atmosphere, to let competence stand without refracting it through the lens of personal grievance. Then, in a voice that sounded almost private in the wide room, Charles said, "Your father sent a message, I believe. Something about attendance at family events." He didn't ask me to confirm. He made a small joke of the absurdity of excluding someone who brought value not just in sentiment, but in measurable, negotiable terms. I watched 3 reactions at once. Blake's face pulsed with discomfort. Patricia's mouth tightened in the way one reserves for a thought they do not want to speak aloud. And Charles, His expression shifted from amused to something that had a steel edge. For a man who had made a career out of being the final word in rooms like this, the idea of someone being excluded for social posture struck a dissonant chord. "Tell me," Charles said, his voice taking on a steadier timbre, "why would family decide to exclude someone in the first place?" It was not meant to be an interrogation. It was more like a historian marking a contradiction. I answered without dramatics. I told him, in the spare language of someone used to translating complicated things into direct speech, that families protect their self-image, and often do so at the expense of their members' truths. I did not make it personal beyond fact. I had no interest in litigating my life in that conference room. I was there to close a pilot and establish a relationship that could scale. Still, the reveal had already done its work. You could see the meeting reframing itself. The Harringtons had been ready to consider us as a vendor, but now they were weighing us as a partner to be respected, and the social calculus had shifted too. The irony was almost neat in its symmetry. The people who thought they were securing their family's social capital by excluding me were, in one swoop, exposed to the reality that their definition of success was narrow and brittle. A man across from me, an operations VP from one of Harrington's divisions, leaned forward and asked about implementation. He used the language of a man thinking in units and days. "How soon can you integrate? What's the timeline for a test pilot with measurable KPIs?" I laid out a 6-week pilot with 2 defined KPIs, an integration timeline that required a single weekend of cutover, and an SLA that mitigated their risk. Michael supplied details about on-site support. Lisa quietly dropped a projection about realized savings across 3 years. Charles listened to the practicalities like a judge listening to an argument that might determine corporate well-being. Then, after a beat, he did something that had the faint flavor of theater, but was, to him, simply the honest thing to do. He laughed, short, incredulous, almost delighted, at the absurdity of being in a position where family politics had tried to render a capable adult invisible. He told a small anecdote, the sort of private joke one shares with the room to release tension. "If someone in my family excluded a person based on whim, I'd want to know why," he said. "And if it cost me an opportunity, I'd be annoyed." His laugh scattered the remaining social veneer. People in that room, even those with polished smiles, are trained to read leverage. Neutrality shifted into opportunity. When Charles spoke next, his words were no longer simply a comment about a personal matter. They were the first framing of a potential business intent. "We have a procurement review next quarter," he said. "If the pilot goes well, there's room for a 3-year engagement." The room exhaled in the way rooms do when someone makes a macro decision from a micro action. For us, it was not yet a signed contract, but it was closer than the polite interest of earlier calls. It was the kind of doorway that led to negotiations, and eventually, paper. In a week, if the pilot executed as promised, the conversation would be about scope and number. For the moment, it was about being visible. Claire got quieter as the meeting proceeded. I could see the outline of embarrassment clenched into the set of her jaw. Guilt often looks like a recalibration of volume. She asked one question about internal communications, and then another, less sharp, more searching. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized that a story they had been telling themselves about their sibling didn't match the present. After the meeting concluded, Charles rose and walked over to the demo station. He extended his hand and, in the same manner industry men often use when they want to close an arrangement with both respect and decisiveness, he said, "Ms. Morrison, I apologize for any awkwardness that occurred outside this room. We will judge you by your work. If your pilot produces the outcomes you've outlined, I'll see to it that Harrington treats supply-wise with the seriousness it merits." His words were both businesslike and unambiguous. He had not promised a favor designed to make my family blush at holiday dinners. He had established a professional posture. But there was something else, too, a personal flicker of indignation at the family's earlier message. He told me, with that rare cut of real sincerity that business encounters occasionally produce, that being dismissed for the sake of a social script was a form of injustice he found distasteful. His handshake was firm, and when he let go, he said, half smiling, "And by the way, if you ever want to bring up anything with your family, tell them I said it's poor form to exclude your guests without cause." There was a warmth to it that felt like an offer of protection without an obligation attached. Bodies in that room shifted, some in surprise, some in the quick corrective motions of executives who immediately imagined how this might be framed in their next board decks. I left the meeting with the team, ankles buzzing with adrenaline and a careful reserve I have practiced when adrenaline mingles with a public reveal. The pilot was on the table. The numbers indicated a likely path to a larger engagement. But more than that, the meeting had been an unplanned reclassification. A family's peripheral figure had been revealed in a light that made exclusion look ridiculous in the face of measurable value. On the ride back to our office, Michael put a hand on my shoulder like he did when the world was about to tilt in an inconvenient direction. "That was something," he said. He doesn't do melodrama. It was praise folded into practical concern. "You handled it well. I kept the room on the problem, not on myself," I said. It was a sentence that described both a strategy and a temperament. People who do what I do are trained to move the focus from personality to outcome. It is a small protective manual for survival. Yet my phone buzzed again in the taxi. This time it was a different vibration. 3 missed calls, a text chain, a photograph. My dad had sent a single line, "We need to talk." There was no signature because signatures are unnecessary when your parent signs with a past version of themselves. I did not answer in the cab. For reasons that contained both dignity and a strategic pause, I waited until I was back at my office, the skyline a paper cutout beyond the glass. I walked into our conference room where my team was buzzing with plans for the pilot and felt a peculiar cross-current, professional clarity amidst personal unsettlement. "Do you want me to call them?" Lisa asked, sensible and direct. "No," I said, "not yet." There is a rhythm to these moments that is instructive. The first act is to tend to the work. The second is to decide if anything else will be allowed to touch it. I choose the work first because it is where agency is clearest. My parents' message had been meant to keep me out of a house for holiday consumption. This was not the same kind of exclusion, and I would not let it define my response. We set the pilot timelines, assigned leads, and drafted a risk mitigation memo for the Harrington team. Practically speaking, the next 6 weeks would be the part of the story where everything either proved out or did not. Emotionally, the meeting had been seismic. The family had sent one text to exclude me from something symbolic, and in turn, the world had sent a small, professional reckoning in the form of a corporation that now needed what my company offered. There is a particular satisfaction that comes from making people recalibrate, but it is also a vulnerable satisfaction, one that requires you to hold your boundaries and keep your intentions clear. I did not want vindication so much as integrity. I wanted to be acknowledged on my own terms, not as a cameo in someone else's narrative, but as the author of my own chapter. Later that afternoon, my sister called. I let it go to voicemail because the team needed focus, and because conversations with family often carry the ballast of inherited habits that are difficult to unfasten. The message was clipped and nervous. She sounded like someone walking on ice. "Jade, Dad texted. "I'm sorry. Can we talk tonight?" I listened to her words twice before deleting the voicemail. I called back after the team left for the evening. Claire answered on the second ring. Her hello was small, an attempt at normality. "I saw the deck," she said, immediately hitting the part of the conversation that was true. There was apology braided into her voice, but also embarrassment. "I didn't know. I'm sorry about what they said." We spoke for 20 minutes that felt like a measured negotiation of feeling. She apologized for not telling me when the family had their conversations about social invitations, for not speaking up. There was truth to that apology, and also a recognition of how habit and belonging can mute courage. I heard her, and I let her hear me. I did not let the conversation become a confessional or an arbitration of worth. That was not what I wanted. What I wanted was simply acknowledgement and a path forward that would be based on new facts rather than old assumptions. By the time I hung up, I had steeled myself for the days to come, for a pilot, for the inevitable conversations that would follow in living rooms and at kitchen tables, for the way my parents might try to re-assimilate the fact of me into their story. I also felt a small, steady warmth at the center of the evening. My team had watched me in that room, had seen me move a deal into motion, and they were already planning a pilot that could rewrite a relationship between our two organizations. I made a decision that night, not dramatic, but deliberate. I would not let the family narrative be the one that defined my public life. I would let my work speak, and if people wanted to understand, I would give them the facts, not a performance. I would accept apologies only when sincerity came with sustained behavior rather than a late-stage concession. I had learned over the years that forgiveness is not an immediate valve you turn on. It is an architecture you build. Sleep came in fits. I woke with the taste of coffee in my mouth and a tickle of adrenaline behind my eyes. My phone vibrated with a calendar invite from Harrington for a follow-up pilot kickoff. My inbox had a note from Charles's assistant requesting a few more technical documents to finalize the pilot scope. The hallway outside our office smelled like wet pavement and takeaway lunch from the downstairs deli. Life, in its inevitable banality, moved. The pilot kickoff was scheduled for a Wednesday. The team prepped for it in ways that had nothing to do with family dynamics and everything to do with deliverables. We created a clean integration script, allocated engineers for weekend deployment windows, and planned a communications cadence. But human impulses are not so easily bracketed. The encounter in the Harrington conference room had left a residue. People had seen a story rewrite itself, and they were curious how the characters outside of us would respond. On the morning of the kickoff, the lobby felt heavier than before. The fortune cover I had noticed earlier seemed to watch me like a witness that had just been updated and had to refile its narrative. I walked through the atrium with Michael and Lisa flanking me, and on the elevator ride up, I realized that whatever happened with the pilot would not only be a business metric, it would be data in a larger story about who gets to define success and how family scripts can be rewritten by honest work. We stepped into the suite and found the same faces from the earlier meeting. Blake looked uncomfortable again, his smile an anxious muscle. Patricia watched with the practiced curiosity of someone who had to digest new information into their internal storybook. Charles folded his hands again. He greeted me with a measure of formality, and then, slightly out of protocol, said, "Let's get to work." We did. Engineers were introduced, the scope was locked, endpoints were exchanged. We outlined rollback plans, authorization schema, and the nerves that come with launching anything live at scale. After a few hours of technical talk that made my fingers itch for the whiteboard, Charles motioned to a side table and offered coffee. He leaned back and for a moment said something that felt both paternal and corporate. "I'm not in the business of letting family theatrics dictate enterprise decisions. If you prove what you promised, you will be treated as equals. That's how we should behave." It was a conditional blessing, a public affirmation with a business undertone, and it landed in the room like a stone thrown into a pool. Ripples spread. It was the kind of statement that makes people imagine the moment reprised in family rooms. We were wrong, people might say, or we didn't know. But I am not interested in scripting their remorse. I was interested in measurable outcomes. We finished the kickoff with a handshake and a plan. The pilot would go live the following weekend. The operations team would be on standby. My engineers were nervous and elated. There is a particular kind of camaraderie in a team facing a live deployment. It is equal parts professional focus and adrenaline. The issues, when they appear, are fixable. The outcomes are binary in ways that family refrains rarely are. As I walked back through Harrington's atrium, I heard a soft, almost private laugh behind me. Charles called after me, his voice carrying a warmth that was part amusement and part reproof. "By the way," he said, "tell your parents I said hello." It was a small, pointed invitation. It was also an unworkmanlike thing to say in corporate terms. Personalities rarely get mixed into contracts. But then again, I had never thought I would be in a room where my father's text and my company's API would share air at once. On the ride back, I let myself imagine telling my parents in a way that wasn't meant to punish or gloat. I was curious about what it would look like to say facts and to let them stand. But curiosity is an indulgence. There are tactical moments for it, and tactical moments for restraint. I chose restraint. Back at the office, Michael clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You ready for this?" Ready is a complicated word. Ready means resource allocations are in place, the legal team has signed off on the pilot SLAs, and you have the emotional bandwidth to weather the inevitable press of family questions. Ready, in the way I used it, meant I had not given away my agency. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen and let the quiet come. The Civic sat in our dim garage, a testament to decisions made long ago about how visible I wanted to be. Around me, holiday lights had begun to appear in neighbor windows. For some families, those lights are a coordination of tradition and ritual. For others, they are a reminder of the invitations and exclusions that shape belonging. My father texted again, "We'll stop by Sunday." No explanation, no caveat. Just a factual sentence that carried the weight of an unscheduled visit, an attempt perhaps to repair, or perhaps to reassert. I did not reply. Sometimes the first step in boundary setting is silence measured not by avoidance but by purpose. I went to bed thinking about the next week's integrations, the pilot metrics, and the odd geometry of family life. Outside, the city was a scatter of lights that suggested other people's joys and other people's curated appearances. The next morning, the inbox had 3 items: the pilot progress board, a note from Lisa about projected cash flows if the pilot scaled, and a forwarded article from Forbes that mentioned supply-wise in passing. The world keeps issuing facts. People keep issuing feelings. On Thursday, an email landed in my inbox with a subject line that read simply, "Charles Harrington would like to speak with you." The message was from his assistant, firm and to the point. A short window at the end of the week, an invitation to meet in his office for coffee to discuss pilot expectations. There was no mention of family or dinners, only logistics. It was a meeting request and, more importantly, a signal. The Harringtons were treating this as work. I accepted. When you spend years building something quietly, you learn to walk a line between revealing too much and exposing just enough. The Harrington meeting had shifted the axis. The text from my dad had been an attempt to shape that axis according to old scripts. The corporate interest had applied a new gravity. In rooms and in families, who gets to define success is often the question that turns polite conversations into awkward moments of truth. By the time Friday evening rolled around, I had a box of notes, a quiet dinner at my desk, and a phone with an unattended chain of texts from my parents. I left them unread. There is a cruelty reserve you keep for yourself and for others. Sometimes you withhold responses not out of malice, but to protect the clarity of your next steps. Saturday morning, my phone buzzed again. It was Dad, 3 short lines. "Are you coming to Christmas now? Claire wants to know." I read it in the same clinical way I read terms and contracts. Neutral, to be decided on the merit of facts and behavior. I hit reply and typed 3 words that felt measured and true. "We should talk." I didn't press send immediately. I took a breath, a small habit I had developed for moments that could tilt into real rupture. Then I pressed send. There is an old story, maybe an invention, about how families will often speak louder in the currency of shame than in the currency of truth. My phone, which had been the instrument of dismissal, was now the place where dialogue could begin. The Harrington pilot would start in less than a week. My work might correct a business problem. My family might still be working with a narrative that would take longer to rewrite. At noon, I walked through the office and watched my team run tests. The demo pipeline hummed in the background, a kind of machine music that soothed me in its predictability. Around the main monitor, the team had stuck Post-it notes with contingency plans, tiny flags of care. Chosen family, I thought. We are the ones who stand in the trenches together. The door to my office opened, and Michael stepped in with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite alarm. "They sent a note," he said. "Charles wants to move faster if the pilot shows immediate savings. He's asked us to be ready to present to procurement next Thursday." That tightened something in my chest in a way that was not unpleasant. Momentum is a precise kind of gravity. "We'll be ready," I said. He nodded and left. The rhythm of execution returned to us like a current. We worked for hours, debugging callbacks, cleaning logs, rehearsing the case for procurement. Outside, the city lanterns blinked on like staged applause. By Friday night, the pilot environment was set. I stood in the server room with the lights low and watched the dashboards replay data like a heartbeat on a monitor. For a long time, I watched the lines flow, steady and true. Then I left for home, the smallness of the civic feeling less like a concealment and more like a choice. It was my car. It was not an emblem designed for anyone else's approval. That weekend, as pilot dates approached and family texts hovered in my pocket, I slept in small increments, knowing the first big reveal was still to come. I had been excluded from a holiday by a 3-line message and then included in a corporate meeting by a 1-line email. The ways people choose who belongs are curious and far from straightforward. Monday morning, the pilots began, and the dashboard lights went green. The algorithm did what it had been designed to do. It sniffed out inventory mismatches, recommended reroutes, and carved out immediate savings that were visible within the first 12 hours. We watched the numbers climb in a way that felt like vindication, not of the petty sort, but the professional kind, the kind that comes from craft and iteration. Then, mid-afternoon, the office door opened and Claire walked in. She looked as if she had been doing something she did not want to do, and yet felt compelled by necessity. Her eyes searched the room not like a person owning a catwalk, but like someone looking for an anchor. She approached my desk and said simply, "Can we talk?" I nodded and closed my laptop. The room seemed quieter. The hum of the monitors felt suddenly loud. She sat down across from me, and there was, in her face, a kind of rawness I had not seen before. It was not performative. It was the look of someone who had been surprised by the truth of another person and did not know yet where to place it. "I saw the kickoff," she said. "Dad called. He's weirdly quiet, like he's recalibrating. I'm sorry. I should have told you when the invitation came around. I don't know why I didn't." There is a complicated currency in apologies. Some are rehearsed and cheap. Others are difficult and true. The difference is in how they are offered. Claire's apology was small and specific. It was not sweeping. It did not attempt to heal everything with a single sentence. It sat in front of me like an offering. "I appreciate that," I said. "What matters to me is that people notice what's true now. I'm not interested in retrospective awards. I want consistent behavior." She nodded, and for a minute neither of us spoke. Outside, the city moved and the pilot ran on. Inside, there was a conversation being stitched together that would, in time, need more than words. As she stood up, she touched my hand, an awkward human gesture not meant to fix but to signify an attempt. "If you want, they're asking if you'll reconsider Christmas," she said quietly. I let the question hang. The invite was not an apology, and it was not a commitment. It was an overture that must be measured. I'll let you know, I said. She left with the soft weight of complicated love. The office door closed and the monitors kept humming. People at their desks glanced up and then back to screens. Life resumed its technical rhythm. A few hours later, my phone buzzed. Charles had sent a short message through his assistant requesting an in-person meeting the next day. The subject line, tiny and corporate, read simply, "Quick conversation." I looked at the screen and felt two currents at once, one that wanted me to march into personal reconciliations, and another that told me to let my work run as proof. I chose the latter. I clicked accept on the calendar invite and typed a confirmation. Then I opened the pilot dashboard and watched the metrics continue to climb. There is an odd kind of justice in watching work you believe in do what it was meant to do. It is not revenge. It is evidence. The Harringtons had been told to keep me out of a family celebration. They had been invited into a room where my competence mattered to their business interests. The two facts were not unrelated, but they did not have to be conflated. That night, I made a small decision for myself. Whatever the outcome with my parents and whatever the offers of reconciliation, I would celebrate in a way that reflected who I had chosen to be. My team had been in the trenches with me for months. If there was to be a celebration, it would be with them. We booked a short company retreat in Aspen. It was practical, an off-site to review the pilot results and plan the procurement presentation, and also something else, a small island of warmth that would let us close the quarter and step away from whatever script my parents were still rehearsing. We rented a cabin with high beams and a big kitchen table. Engineers slept on couches, and someone brought a record player that had only 3 albums on it. It didn't matter. There was a comfort in the ordinariness of it. Takeout, black coffee, and a whiteboard full of integration notes. On our last night there, after a long session of whiteboarding and laughter that edged into relief, Michael brought out a bottle of cheap champagne he'd been saving since the seed days. Lisa uncorked it like she did budgets, careful and with a small smile. We all toasted the pilot, the team, and the fact that we had built something real together. My chest felt full in a way that had nothing to do with making a point to anyone else. Halfway through the toast, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Charles Harrington. I put the bottle down and answered, expecting logistics or a debrief. His voice on the line was warm and private in a way the conference room rarely allowed. "Jade," he said, "I just wanted to tell you that the board saw the pilot metrics. They liked what they saw. We're prepared to move forward with a 3-year agreement at the numbers we discussed. Our legal team will draft papers next week. Also, this is not business exactly. I meant what I said about the family. I'll be reaching out to your parents to clear up the absurdity of that message. If you need anything in the meantime, tell me." He offered it as both a courtesy and a line in the sand. I could hear the echo of a man who believed procedure should meet principle. "Thank you," I said. "We'll be ready." He paused, and then, more softly, "Also, if you're open to it, Patricia asked if you might join them for dinner. She said she'd like a chance to apologize in person." The offer landed differently than I had expected. It was neither an ultimatum nor an apology dressed up as a favor. It was a meaningful invitation with a plausible path to repair. I told him I appreciated the gesture and that I would consider it. He ended the call wishing me well, and, somehow, the moment let a small fissure form in the scaffolding I'd been erecting around myself, an opening that could, with care, become a bridge. A week later, the legal pads arrived. A contract for a 3-year engagement, and the figures we had negotiated, numbers that made the finance team breathe easier, and my CFO nod like someone affirming a job well done. We executed the contract in a quiet room with slimmer chairs than the Harrington boardroom and a legal team that traded clauses like chess moves. When the final page hit the stack, Lisa let out a low, satisfied whistle. 3 years, she said. This changes projections in a good way. The news spread through the company in the non-dramatic way good work does. An all-hands email, a few celebratory lunch orders, and then a return to the steady rhythm of execution. To me, the contract was both professional closure and proof to myself that I could keep my life's work compartmentalized and intact, even when family life tried to rewrite the terms. That same afternoon, Charles followed through on his promise. He called my parents. I learned about it because my father walked into our reception area the next morning as if he'd misplaced an errand and found the lobby sign reading Supply-Wise AI. He looked smaller than the man who had sent me the 3-line exclusion. Something in the tilt of his shoulders had shifted from certainty to bewilderment. "Jade," he said, the name wobbling at the edge of familiarity. "Can we talk? My office has glass walls. People can see the board with our Sprint statuses, see the way I keep the room tidy in the corners that matter. They could also see me sit down, close my laptop, and turn off the public part of my face." I stood and walked into the lobby. My mother followed more slowly. I could see the guilt etched into her hands, the quick movements of someone who wanted to smooth a fabric that had been creased for years. Claire lingered at the doorway, eyes downcast. Dad tried at first to speak like a man who was explaining a thought. "Jade," he said, Charles called. He wanted to explain that, well, he's involved in our business now. We didn't know what to do with the information about you. It was awkward. Patricia called, and he left the sentence unfinished in the way people do when remorse is smaller than the damage. My mother's voice broke in, apologetic and precise in equal measure. "We were embarrassed," she said. "We didn't know how to integrate this, all of it. We thought we were protecting the family." That phrasing, protecting the family, has a long life in our house. It meant, for my parents, keeping appearances tidy and the household narrative consistent. It had never occurred to them that their idea of protection might be a partition that keeps people out. I listened. I owed them my attention, but not my absolution. I wasn't interested in a public display of contrition. I wanted specificity and a willingness to change. "You sent me a text that told me I wasn't welcome," I said simply. That was the thing. Not the party, not the holiday, though that hurt. The heart of it is that you made a decision about my presence without knowing who I am. That's what I need to see change. Dad blinked, like a man trying on a new piece of clothing that didn't fit yet. "I didn't know," he said. Claire said, "It was short notice. I didn't think." "You didn't know," I repeated. "You have the chance to know now. That means asking questions before making decisions. It means telling the truth about what matters to you and not expecting me to perform gratitude for being allowed at the table. If you want me in your life, it has to be with a new baseline, respect and curiosity, not convenience." There was a silence that felt like a held breath across 3 generations. My mother's hands folded like a small, intentional apology. Claire stepped forward, voice thin. "I should have told you," she said. "I told Blake I'd handle it, and I didn't. I'm sorry." It was a true apology, small, insufficient, and real. It landed like a single step taken toward repair rather than a grand declamation. My parents asked for a chance to make it right. I told them the conditions. No unilateral exclusions, openness to learn about the work they hadn't understood, and a willingness to let me set boundaries around what I would accept as amends. We did not reconcile in a sweeping cinematic way. There was no sudden family montage. Instead, there was a measured agreement. They could come to the office at a time I chose. They could visit our pilot war room and see the dashboards in person. And if they wanted Christmas, they would have to meet me halfway, with honesty rather than a last-minute performance-driven invite. It was not the warm closure they had perhaps hoped for, but it was a start, and it was on my terms. That evening, after the conversation, Charles called again. "I heard how that went," he said. "If it helps at all, Patricia and I would like to invite you to dinner next week. Just a small thing. No obligations, just conversation. Claire will be there. If you don't want to, I understand completely. I considered the offer. I thought of the cabin and the team back in Aspen, the quiet joy of shared work. I thought of the thin line between letting people back in because you want them to change and letting them back in because you want to be liked. In the end, I said yes. Not because I craved family approval, but because the invitation came with an honest, unassuming tone. It wasn't fame by proxy. It was an opening. Christmas arrived, and I made a choice that felt true to the year's work. I would spend the holiday with the team in Aspen and later meet the Harringtons for a quiet dinner. The team cheered like it was a minor holiday of its own. We cooked a communal meal, swapped badly sung carols, and traded stories about the worst holidays we'd endured. There was an ease to our laughter that felt earned. On Christmas evening, as the wind moved the pines outside and the cabin lights hummed low, my phone lit with a message from Charles. Dinner on the 27th. Patricia wants to apologize in person. No pressure. I typed back a short confirmation and then set the phone face down. The dinner was, as Charles had framed it, small, polite, and honest. Patricia's apology was quiet and specific. She did not attempt to gloss over the text sent in haste. Claire sat between us and spoke with an honesty that made her voice steadier. There were moments that felt tender and moments that felt awkward. There was also a generosity in their willingness to let me be the steward of how close we got. We did not reconcile everything that night. My parents' habits are old and their scripts are long. But the dinner ended with a sense of possibility rather than the old certainty of exclusion. They asked questions about the pilot, about how the technology worked, and I answered them the way I answered clients, clearly without condescension. It was, for all of us, an exercise in translating one's life into facts someone else could understand. When I walked back to the car that night, Patricia touched my arm. "Thank you for coming," she said. She did not demand immediate forgiveness. She offered a tentative step. I accepted it as the start of something that would take patience. Back at the cabin, my team had staged a small, impromptu toast. They were the people who had stood up every late night. They were the ones who had rewired a pilot overnight. They were the family I had chosen for survival and triumph. We poured cheap champagne into paper cups and toasted the contract, the pilot, and the fact that we had made a life together that could withstand the kinds of small cruelties my childhood had normalized. I looked around at faces that knew the lines of my work better than some of my kin. Michael raised his cup and said, without flourish, "To being seen for the right things." We laughed and drank. The cabin felt warm and sustained by the banal rituals of those who share a mission rather than a lineage. That night, I thought about how the year had rearranged the coordinates of my life. A 3-line text had been meant to keep me small. A pilot had been the instrument by which I refused that keeping. The Harrington contract, signed,